So as we begin our service, we get into this time of, I hope, reflection as well as worship, that I offer some words by Black Elk of the Oglala Lakota people this morning. Then I was standing on the highest mountain of them all, and round me was the whole hoop of the world. And while I stood there, I saw more than I can tell. And I understood more than I saw. For I was seeing in a sacred manner the shape of all things, of the Spirit, and the shapes as they must live together like one being. And I saw the sacred hoop of my people was one of many hoops that make one circle, wide as daylight and starlight, and in the center grew one mighty flowering tree to shelter all the children of one mother and one father. And I saw that it was holy.
Facebook page, as a friend of mine in the folk club sings that song quite often. Today's reading is from one of the books written by one of the speakers in our Exploring Indigenous History adult program here at UU Miami. Gilio-whitaker is from the Colville Confederated Tribes of the Pacific Northwest, and she reminds us that many scientists believe we are undergoing the Earth's 6th mass extinction. In that vein, she writes, from an American Indian perspective, we're all on the reservation now. One of the largest pieces of learning we did as a group was to know that we are learning the history of the indigenous, to be awakened, and to indeed join the struggle of our current indigenous people and neighbors. My reading is about one of the biggest modern day fights of our indigenous, the Standing Rock saga of 2016, the story of the Dakota Access Pipeline as it runs today. As things often do in Indian country, it began with a story. This one, a prophecy. Ancestors of today's Lakota, the people of Sakowin, had for generations warned about a black snake that would slither across the land, bringing destruction to the earth and her people. The day representatives for Energy Transfer Partners entered the council chambers of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribe on September 30th, 2014 to present plans for the Dakota Access Pipeline, and it perhaps came as no surprise to the tribal council that another pipeline was threatening Lakota lands. Other Lakota bands, Plains tribes, and white ranchers and farmers were, after all, already fighting the Keystone XL pipeline. But nobody that day would have predicted the debacle that the Dakota Access Pipeline would turn into, the extremes to which Energy Transfer Partners would go to put down tribal opposition to the project, beginning with the CEO lie that the tribe had not registered their dissent to the project early enough, and that if they had, the pipeline would have been rerouted. Or the human rights abuses by Energy Transfer Partners, private security firms, and militarized state police that would bring United Nations observers to the protest camps by 2016. The startling truth is that there are 2.4 million miles of black snakes in the United States. These pipelines convey more crude oil, gasoline, heating oil, and natural gas than any other country in the world. Pipelines are so ubiquitous and normalized in the American political landscape that they aren't even heavily regulated. So when Energy Transfer Partners initiated the permitting and construction project, it was business as usual. At the same time, opposition to the Keystone X pipeline had become so high profile due to the organizing of many diverse groups that President Barack Obama had rejected the Keystone permit, sealing its fate in 2015. What took Energy Transfer Partners by surprise, however, was the Obama administration's order to halt the Dakota Access Pipeline. The resistance movement that had begun in 2012 was organized around many hashtags by a small group of women from the Standing Rock Sioux tribe, and they set up a camp and named it the Camp of the Sacred Stones. The idea was to monitor pipeline construction while registering tribal dissent in a tangible way, and as they hoped, to stop the project. The council argued that while the route was not within current reservation boundaries, it was well within the boundaries acknowledged by the 1851 Treaty of Fort Laramie and the Treaty of 1868. The council expressed its concern about the potential of desecrating sacred sites and the danger of contaminating the community's water supply. Many of you know the rest of the story. Even though Obama stopped the project, we suffered an election that overturned the stoppage, and the Dakota Access Pipeline now delivers 500,000 gallons of the crudest petroleum a day for a foreign company. Lawsuits of environmental racism are working their way through stacked courts. But gilio-whitaker acknowledges that the profits of the fossil fuel conglomerates continue to be protected while our waters are not.
Well, how can I explain to you the profound experience of listening to Indigenous voices, hearing their stories, hearing their histories I never knew, and hearing histories that I knew from an entirely different perspective. After listening, I came away with a need to act, to do more than listen. But I also realized that I have to keep listening. And in that spirit, I want you to hear pieces of what I heard over these many weeks. Here is artist and activist Greg Deal. He is from the Pyramid Paiute tribe.
This is a mural that I did in Denver. I actually did it in a heavily gentrified area, which kind of looks like I'm not trying to make friends. But it was there, and it's meant to challenge. It's meant to raise questions. Likewise, with the mural work, our statements such as this. This piece is actually in the basement of CU Boulder, and it's in the colors of the school. I worked with an office to, this is in the basement of the art and art history building, but if you walk into that basement, it's like a whole corridor. So I did the entire, all 4 sections of this wall. And they wanted me to do this piece, and they wanted me to do it in the school colors. So there was a little bit of, I guess, dissent happening within my work. And I mean, I think most people expect some artists on some level to do that. But it's also meant to sort of raise questions that, you know, places like colleges are in, like colleges and cities are in places that are traditionally been native spots. Most of the highways and roads that are created in the United States have at one time been trade trails. And so there is a lot of parallels to where these cities are. Denver, which is about an hour from where I live, was a major trade place. So people would come from the mountains because we're right at the foot of the Rocky Mountains on the east side. People would come down from the mountains to trade. People would come from the plains to trade. People would come from the north and from the south. All the trade in Denver and in places like Kansas. They just recently found a group or a series of intricate spaces that denote buildings and trail routes and all sorts of things in Missouri. And where they oftentimes has been dismissed, like, well, there wasn't a lot of Indians here, there wasn't a lot of this, there wasn't a lot of that. And in fact, there's some significant trade routes through those spaces. So this statement isn't just flippant, but actually is rooted in the fact that a lot of the spaces that we now reside as Americans are also spaces that were originally occupied by indigenous communities and indigenous people with indigenous trade routes and systems of trade set up that were pretty elaborate.
I don't know if all of you heard what I heard CNN commentator and politician Rick Santorum say a few weeks ago. He said, "We birthed a nation from nothing." I mean, there was nothing here. I mean, yes, we have Native Americans, but candidly, there isn't much Native American culture in American culture. Did you cringe as I did when I heard this? I mean, I have to say, not in his defense, but in reality, I wasn't taught much in the way of indigenous people, of the history of indigenous people in my history classes. I don't think many people were. Most of what I heard was about European colonization. But I did, I think we all have, seen streets, mountains, parks with indigenous names. And I remember in my history book, there was some sentence, just a sentence, about some Native American tribes used a more democratic form of government. I don't know if you read that or remember that from your history books. Have you heard of the Indigenous Confederation under the Great Law of Peace, which was founded in 1142 ACE? Benjamin Franklin referred to this particular Iroquois model of government when he presented his plan for the union of the 13 colonies. Also presenting to the 13 colonies was an indigenous person, Onondaga, who was leader of the Kanasa-Tego tribe. He presented this form of government, and he said to them that many bundles of arrows cannot be broken. Many bundled arrows cannot be broken as easily as one arrow. Speaking about the 13 colonies coming together and forming a government and being stronger. And yes, you know what? Look at this. This is the Great Seal of the United States. And what was included in that seal are those 13 arrows, held by an eagle, saying that, in a sense, we are stronger together than alone. So, my friends, if you didn't know, Indigenous people have had some impact on our culture. And you know, Greg did say that trading routes and towns of the indigenous people are now the highways and cities of the United States. I have to say I was surprised, or maybe it didn't come into my consciousness. Almost all these trade routes and towns have been covered over in cement. And they are now our roads, our cities. Highway 1, Interstate 45, Denver, Kansas, Kansas City. We have whitewashed so much. This map that you see, and I know you can't see it well, whether you're looking at it on the computer or it shows all the different indigenous peoples in America. You know, I don't think I ever saw this map in my history book. This is from the 1600s. Is it a wonder, any wonder, that Greg uses his art to get our attention, making us look at indigenous people's history and the issues they have faced and still face? Even lack of recognition of how they filled this country, managed the land, traded with one another, interacted with one another across this great country, across the Americas. And now let's hear from records keeper for the Mohawk County of the Kanawake Nation, an activist, Kara Dawn Zemmel.
Unka ti ne zanistaha? This is a question that you get in almost any community of typically Native people, but very much Iroquois or Mohawk people. It means, who is your mother? Because we came from a matrilineal society, we had a matrilineal clan system. We didn't have last names before. We had our clan. So you always got your clan from your mother. And when a man and a woman married, the husband left his home and moved into the longhouse. We didn't live in teepees, we lived in longhouses. He moved into the longhouse of his wife, her sisters and their families, her parents, her mother's mother, if she was still alive. That was the way that the society was built. So if you moved in with your family, if your wife's family was, say, the Turtle clan, that whole extended Turtle clan is their family, not just that longhouse, say. It's considered your family, so you had to marry outside of your clan. And that's how we determined our lineage. Like I said, we didn't have last names. The Mohawk word that we use for last name is Dewaksanazerde. And when you translate that, it means the name I drag behind myself, because we were forced to take last names. It wasn't our practice. And now all of a sudden, with like our mother wasn't supposed to be important, and now all of a sudden we're supposed to take our father's last name. It was very completely opposite from what we were used to.
Can you imagine how you understood family, how you were named by a group of people who invaded and colonized your land? Can you imagine having to change your name, change how you experienced your family? Can you imagine that? I mean, I just can't. I mean, you think about moving, you know, they were a matrilineal and they moved in with their wife's family, and that's that became their family, and then they were told, no, that's not your family. Your family is your father, and your name is your father's name, it's not your mother's name. You couldn't fit in, you couldn't function in this colonized society unless you took the name that they gave to you, or they said you had to have. And the name that you were able to trace your lineage back for generations, according to matrilineal heritage, was just taken away. Only if you wanted to function in a colonized world. Can you imagine being told that you have to use your father's name when all you've ever known is your mother's name or your wife's name or your wife's family's name? That you had to take the name you dragged behind you. I mean, I can't even imagine. It's just, it boggles the mind. And how would you feel once your culture was taken away? Once your language was taken away? Once your people were taken away? Many indigenous people lost their family connections, lost their languages and traditions. You know, a couple of weeks ago I told a story about the two wolves. You know, and I don't know if you've heard this story. It's a white wolf and a black wolf, and they are inside you. They're part of who your consciousness is, and they fight inside you for dominance. One's good, one's evil, and the story goes the one you feed is the one that kind of is dominant inside you. The story is culturally attributed to various indigenous cultures. And those people who have indigenous heritages, who've lost their heritage, have gleamed onto this story as a way of holding on to their heritage with some kind of connection to their background, to their history. The big lie is that the two wolf story is an indigenous story. It's not. It was written by evangelist Billy Graham. And you know, in the United States, legally, you're considered Native American based on how far back you can trace your blood relatives. This is a card that many people have who have been able to trace their lineage back. It says the percentage of blood you have that makes you Native American, half or 3/4 or whatever it is. Blood quantum laws or Indian blood laws are laws in the United States and the former 13 colonies that define Native American status by fractions of Native American ancestry. A person's blood quantum is defined as the fraction of their ancestors out of their total ancestors who are documented as full-blood Native American. According to these laws, these laws that were designed by white people in the 1700s, you can't live on indigenous lands, be considered part of an indigenous nation, or claim indigenous family without a certain percentage of blood ancestry. But is this how the indigenous people themselves define who and who is not Native American? No, that's not how they decide. I don't know if I've told you this, but my mother researched our family's indigenous ancestry. My great-grandmother was a full-blood Cherokee. My grandmother was white passing, and so denied her indigenous heritage. It took years for my mother to get legal documentation proving her heritage, and she's 1/4 Cherokee, which means she can, if she chooses to, claim indigenous rights. However, I'm 1/8, so I can't claim any indigenous heritage. And besides, the reality is I don't have any connection to that heritage. I don't have any way to claim that. That doesn't make any sense to me. I never lived on Cherokee land. I never learned anything about the Cherokee culture. I was not raised in Cherokee precepts or language. I don't know any Cherokee people. Culturally, I'm white. Legally, I'm white. Within 4 generations, any connection I've had by blood or heritage has been erased. Whitewashed, if you will. Now let's hear from Dina Gilio-Whitaker. She is the Policy Director and Senior Research Associate at the Center for World Indigenous Studies and is an award-winning journalist at Indian Country Media Network. She refers to herself as a researcher and an activist. Whitaker is a Colville Confederated Tribes descendant, which is a Washington tribe.
But what I discovered through 2 different classes was that the way that we talk about, or the way that scholars talk about environmental justice as a discourse and as a theory, there was very little literature about, addressing American Indians and what environmental justice means in precise terms for Native people. There's a lot of case studies, there's a lot of history, or a certain amount anyway at that point, but when you start really getting into the nitty-gritty of what environmental justice is, and the way it's practiced is Indians are pretty much invisible from that discourse, and so it became my research agenda to address that, to fill that gap. And so I came up with this idea that it needed to be indigenized. And that's part of a decolonial approach. So like decolonizing environmental justice also means indigenizing it, meaning to make it responsive to Native people's concerns. And meanwhile, all this other activism is happening. So it really begins as activist movement, as part of the environmental movement. And what I discovered was that in all of that literature, what was not being addressed were indigenous peoples' very different conditions. And those conditions really come down to the history of the U.S. as a colonial state, a settler colonial state, that's built on invasion, genocide, and land theft. Like, none of that's ever mentioned in the literature.
Invaders, colonizers, committing genocide. Today, how many people in the United States would admit that their white ancestors committed genocide? What responsibility do those of us who are white bear for our ancestors' actions? How do those of us who are white, through our actions and attitudes, still perpetuate the system our ancestors imposed? White people rarely consider the indigenous people who are experiencing, or how white people continue to negatively impact indigenous people. People in our Exploring an Indigenous Peoples History of the United States class were certainly impacted as we listened to each of these speakers. Some said to me, as they reflected on these presentations, how dangerous, harmful, deadly the concept of manifest destiny was to the indigenous people. You know, the 19th century belief that the spread of white people across the American continent was both justified and inevitable. One person told of the indigenous people in Anchorage, Alaska, who never ceded their land to the United States, yet it was taken nonetheless. One of our classmates called what they heard as they listened to all these experiences, what they experienced themselves was a sense of horror. It was so horrific. One of my classmates said, we cannot use passive language in talking about colonization and genocide. And many of my classmates said we had to do something. They appreciated the land acknowledgement we do on Sunday mornings now, but we need to do more. Just saying those words is not enough. If we keep doing them without taking any action, it's just empty platitudes. Last Indigenous speaker that I want to share with you this morning is Betty Osceola, whose relatives are from both the Miccosukee and Tequesta tribes.
That we're supposed to exist in harmony with creation. And also we believe that Creator, when he created this creation and he created us, the two-legged animal, that we were supposed to help keep an eye and protect and help his creation flourish. And to also view all of creation around us as our relatives, whether it's the sky, the trees, the water, the air, all walks of life, that we're connected in some way in this labyrinth to take care of the earth all together, all the matter where they reside, and the societies, because we're also taught back in creation, all of creation and all the I'm going to say human beings, because in my language we say yatade. We don't have a direct word, but the closest is saying human being. I always say I'm a natural being in a natural world, because when you call yourself a human being, you kind of disconnect yourself from that natural world, and that's a big issue in today's society. But growing up from early infancy on, when our youth, you know, we say that babies are born with a lot of knowledge, and they can still communicate when they're young with the elements around them. But if you don't foster that connection, over time, they lose that connection. So we're taught from a young age, early on, to keep that connection, and even as adults, to foster that connection in our own generations.
We will continue our presentations next year, or not next church year, in September. The Miccosukee and Tequesta are close. We have access to them. We can go visit them. We can talk to them person to person. And I don't know how many of you know that Betty Osceola has agreed to work with Chris, developing a curriculum for our children, tentatively called First Peoples and Sacred Ecosystems. This is another step for us. The indigenous people who presented to us this spring are willing to continue a relationship with us. And I think we need to continue a relationship with them. Our class talked about attending a local powwow hosted by the Miccosukee. They do that in December. We talked about continuing this class, but not just continuing this class, but asking people in the larger community to join us in this class. We talked about hosting art or music events with indigenous people to support indigenous causes. We also are aware that hosting isn't enough. That we need to involve in anything we do, learning more about indigenous people and developing and continuing relationships with indigenous people. We're not going to do a one-off, native music coffee house. But if we brought someone in, we bring them in with the understanding that we want to get to know them, that we want to work with them, that we want to understand why they want to be with us, and then we want them to understand why we're with them. One thing I realized near the end of all this that I really hadn't when we started, we've talked about paying attention to pronouns with people who have different gender identities. What about attending to the indigenous person's true name rather than the westernized ones we've imposed on them? I'm hoping we can work on that as well. I know I want to try. I'm committed to doing more than just land acknowledgement, and I hope you will join me in that work. All these are challenges, and we will not be perfect in doing any of them. But as Unitarian Universalists, we understand we're all part of the interdependent web of existence. And we're called, I think, because of that, to advocate for indigenous people, to learn more about indigenous people, to acknowledge our, white peoples, those of us who are white, history that's complicated and difficult to hear and difficult to listen to, and that difficult history we share with indigenous people. And we have to find ways to be more allied with indigenous people in the work that makes a difference to them. As I listened to Betty, I felt the depths of her beliefs, but I also heard how hard she and her people try to live their spiritual beliefs, and the sadness she feels at the difficulty she and her people have had trying to carry their culture, their beliefs, their language forward to the next generation. And I heard, and this is probably the most difficult thing for me to say, I've heard how they have been forced to become activists, knowledgeable about the white supremacy culture and laws, so that they can protect their people, their nation, their rights, their very land from the white overculture that seeks to erase them. All our speakers share those concerns. I acknowledge this burden that they bear, and they bear it willingly. But it takes energy away from doing the work of preserving their culture and passing it on to their future generations. Ancient Mother, I hear you calling. I hear your song. I hear your laughter. And I taste your tears.